I spent the last week at ANZAM, and I noticed that there was a lot of talk in Australia about research impact. And so I decided to put a slide in at the opening that shows something that I developed as I wrote our universities, our College of Business policy on research impact. We do a lot of work on supply chain management at Auburn. And there we talk about the value chain. Those of you that are management professors will certainly be familiar with the value chain. And so what I did is I overlaid that onto research impact and developed this idea of a research impact value chain. And so we're involved in these twin goals of knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination as professors. And of course, we're all asking our research questions, looking for theory to explain them, collecting data and analyzing that data, and then saying, okay, well now we've got these interesting findings, so what can we do about them? And there's various ways that we can disseminate knowledge. We can put our findings into applied journals aimed at thought leaders. We can, some of us will look for the popular press, or here I've noticed in Australia there's a lot of emphasis on grant development, and that's an important part of your knowledge dissemination. And then some of us write textbooks, and then also maybe an institutional presence, getting involved with professional organizations or regulatory bodies. And all of these have different outlets. And I've described them along the bear and trace spectrum of what we do with knowledge. And so the first is conceptual. And so there we're talking about using knowledge for general enlightenment. And there, that would certainly be the scholars and the thought leaders. Instrumental is more about using knowledge for specific goals and purposes. And then the symbolic is about using knowledge to defend our positions. And so today, really our emphasis is up here, which is many would consider one of the more difficult aspects of what we do, is managing this difficult process of peer review and trying to get into some of the top academic journals. And as we do that, there's just kind of a few background thoughts before I talk about crafting articles. And to discuss that, I took a picture of the whiteboard in my office, and I've got the same thing at home. And what I've done here is that I've divided kind of the process, the tunnel, if you will, or the funnel of research, where I talk about early stage projects, my late stage projects, everything that's under review, R&R, second R&Rs, and third R&Rs. So you're trying to constantly push things this way down the funnel. And then you notice I've got this big dotted line here where this is the biggest hurdle, trying to get from something that's under review to R&R. And so I am, every day when I walk in, and I've got kind of a little matrix here where, all kinds of annotations and that sort of thing. But every day when I walk in, this kind of hits me in the face. And I'm constantly trying to put things early into the funnel and make their way through. And really, I'm devoting most of my attention right here in this column. Because everything before that dotted line, there's a lot of uncertainty involved. You're working with co-authors, and that they have their own opinions. You don't know who your reviewers are going to be. Your papers can go in all kinds of directions, right? So you don't have a lot of control before that dotted line. But after that dotted line, when you get an R&R, boy, now you know who your reviewers are, you know exactly what you need to do. And as I say to my co-authors, my goal with the first R&R is to put ourselves in the best position for success. You can't control it, right? You can't control everything. There's a lot of aspects of this process you can't control. But we're trying to, with this column, we're trying to put ourselves in a position where we can succeed. And so, I think just a couple of comments here is, I think it's really important on this research agenda to not let one of these papers kind of stop up the flow. I've seen so many people that will just get so hung up with one paper, or that they will not have enough here, right? We talk about having lots of pokers in the fire. It's really important because there's so much uncertainty with these things that you're constantly having enough to be able to handle defeat. So the goal is movement, trying to get from the early stages to the late stages. So then, as you've got this kind of huge research agenda, how do you decide which projects to work on? One thing is that has become important to me in recent years is depth. I actually haven't been an academic for that long. I've been an academic for about 10 years. I was in industry for 20 years before that. And so really this is quite new to me, and that is becoming known for something. And for me, I want to become known for being at the intersection of corporate governance and competitive dynamics. Right? And so when people are thinking about how corporate governance structures affect what firms do, I want my name to be in that conversation. But early on in one's career, this is less important, and there it's more important to have more breadth, right? And doing all things well. And some people can do both. I think two of my role models are Mike Hitt and Dave Ketchen, who they have depth. They're both known for things, but boy, they do a lot of things well. And something else that I think is important when deciding which projects to work on is to try and double up on things, because that helps with depth, right? And so maybe I often will try to find a paper that can share an IV. I've got, developed this IV, and then I say, all right, well, what is some other DV that we can use that with? We've developed maybe a comprehensive data set or something where we can get some IVs, or vice versa, where you've got a DV and you say, let's look at that with multiple IVs and try and get multiple papers out of this. So doubling up can be a great way to identify which projects you're working on. And two other thoughts here that are actually competing with one another. One is to be tenacious, right? It's to find a home for your papers. Ingrid mentioned that, oh, okay, Brian's got some publications, but what she didn't mention is my rejections. Good Lord. I mean, I could just wallpaper my office with rejection letters, right? And so it's really important to that even after you've had a paper rejected, and for example, we're believe that we're going to get an acceptance letter from a journal, a top journal, within the next few days here, because it's a fourth R&R and we finish things up. Well, that paper was rejected at 3 other journals prior to that, and it's completely changed from the time we initially submitted it. You wouldn't, if I showed you the first paper and what we believe will be accepted, you wouldn't think that they came from the same source. So it's really important to be tenacious, and at the same time, it's important to be opportunistic. I also have 4 or 5 papers that are sitting in my desk drawer that we worked long and hard on, and they'll always be in that desk drawer. Because there comes a time when you have to say, look, you know what, these ideas have just gone as far as we could take them, and from an economic standpoint, there's just sunk costs, and you have to say, our time could be better spent on some other projects. So it's important to be able to let go of some projects sometimes. I oftentimes use conferences as a showcase for ideas as well. Conferences or things like this. If you're speaking at a university, that's where I've found some of the best comments come from, is going to a university, presenting your research, and oftentimes my research will take a different tact once I've done that. One other thought here before getting into the craft of writing is the notion of co-authors and who to work with. Right? And so I like to think of this as three different kinds of co-authors that I work with. The first is a clone, someone who really thinks like me. And a good example here is Laszlo Tihany, who was my chair. And of course, I'm kind of made in his image. And so, we think a lot alike, and we work a lot alike. And when we're working together and sharing ideas, everything kind of falls together easily. And so there's real advantages to that because it's really enjoyable to work with each other. At the same time, we can get kind of in a rut because we think so much alike, or maybe we don't think outside the box as much. So it's important also to have consultants, right? Dave Ketchin, I think, is a good example for me here, where Dave he's one of the most published strategy researchers of all time, and it's so enjoyable to be able to give him a project, and he'll just look at things very, very differently. And when we work on a project, I might be putting 95% of the time in, and he'll put 5% of the time in, but his 5% is worth more than my 95% because he's been in this business for so long, and he's so knowledgeable, and he knows what the journals are looking for. And then lastly is a complement. And here, one of my co-authors that I work with a lot is Wei Shi at Indiana University. And Wei is very enjoyable to work with, but he and I are just completely different. We bring a completely different skill set. And oftentimes, he will collect all the data and analyze all the data. And this guy knows every method in the history of methods, right? And after he analyzes the data, he'll come up with some crazy quasi-natural experiment to verify what we've just measured, right? He comes up with these great methodological ideas. And at the same time, I'm coming to him and saying, what if we put these two theories together, right? How can we craft a story from this? And so when I bring an idea to him, he's got ideas about how to measure it. And so the two of us work together really well that way. I feel like this is where I devote most of my energy, is because this has just been so successful. Because when we put our heads together, this is a divide and conquer approach, but you're working on the same ideas here. Here, you're dividing and conquering and working on different parts of the paper, and so I think that's been very successful for me. So I'd like to talk now about crafting papers. Are there any questions? Anything anybody want to discuss about anything we've mentioned so far, working with co-authors or having a research agenda and that sort of thing? Anything that comes to mind? Okay, yeah.
How did you start working with, I forgot the Wei.
Wei,
How do you develop?
Wei was a doctoral student at Rice University, and as I mentioned, I worked in corporate governance arena, and Wei was taking a seminar with Bob Hoskisson, and he came up with a seminar paper that reflected some of the ideas that I did in my dissertation. And so Bob connected us and said, hey, this guy's working in your arena, perhaps you'd want to work with him. And at the time I thought, oh, okay, well, no, I don't really want to do that. But because he's a doctoral student at another university, I've got my own doctoral students to work with. But it's Bob Hoskisson, the president of the Strategic Management Society. You don't really say no to Bob. And so I said, sure, Bob. Tell Wei to send me his paper. And Wei and I hit it off from the beginning. And from there, we came up with more ideas. And every time I came up with an idea, he said, oh, you know what, let me collect data on that. Or I think I have some data where we can measure that. And there's something interesting about Wei, and I work with one other methods-heavy person, Kang Lee. He's a analytics person at Auburn University. And both of them have the same characteristic, and that is that every time I come to them and say, well, what about this? Their response is always, well, I thought about that and measured it this way, and here's what happened, right? They're always ahead of me on the methodological side, and that's really enjoyable. So working with folks like that is just irreplaceable. Other thoughts or questions? Well, before I get into how crafting your papers, I want to tell a story about when I moved to Auburn. Auburn, we're about 90 miles from Atlanta, and I'm not from the South. I'm from the Northeast, and so I'd never been there. And we saw this house online. It's a lake house, and oh, it's so pretty. And so we just fell in love with it. So I flew to Auburn the next day, and I looked at exactly one house in Auburn. And oh, it's so pretty. You walk up to this house, and it's got the cathedral ceilings and glass. You can just see right through the house onto the lake. And I got there at sunset, right? And so I'm looking right through at the lake as I walk up to the house. Walk through the house, walk out onto the back porch, and there's the lake and the sunset. I turned to the realtor and I said, "We'll take it," right? And I called my wife and said, "It's done deal. We've got the house." And she said, "Great. Yeah. So how's the kitchen?" Pretty sure it has one, Yeah, no, I haven't even been in the rest of the house yet, right? And I'll tell you what, we've been there 10 years, and I have not looked back at all. We just love that place. Why do we? And it's been a ton of work. I'll tell you what, we've had to remodel the kitchen completely. And why do I love it so much? Well, location, 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 right? You've heard that before about real estate, and it's so, so true. And that's worked out very well for us with our house. So with papers, introduction, introduction, introduction. That's what it's about. I was just talking with the editor of another journal, and he said that he's reading 1,500 papers a year, and he has to make desk reject decisions on these things. Well, he doesn't read the whole paper. Right? You can't read 1,500 papers to make a desk reject decision. So it's so important what goes in that introduction, and it's so important what goes in that first paragraph, and so important what goes in that first sentence of that first paragraph. It's interesting. Murray Barrick spoke about this at one point, about the anchoring bias. If you're an OB, you're probably familiar with that. And actually, I do this with my students in the executive MBA program. I hand out a jar of jelly beans, and then I ask them to guess how many jelly beans are in the jar. And they write it down on a piece of paper, half the class, right? They write it down on a piece of paper. And so the first person writes their guess down. The second person gets the jelly beans and writes their guess down. And then the other half of the class, I tell them to email me the answer. And so half the class, this is a big class, but half the class is seeing all the guesses that came before. And so the second guess is, it's anchored by the first guess, right? Whereas the second half of the class is they're creating their guesses in a vacuum, and invariably the half that creates their guesses in a vacuum is more accurate on average than the half that is anchored. Why? Is because what's happening is all of those guesses are looking at the first guess. And this is what's happening with papers as well, is that the reviewers and editors are not creating an opinion of the paper in a vacuum. They're starting from that first sentence, and everything is a deviation from what you say in the first sentence, and then the first paragraph, and then the introduction. You're establishing an opinion of the paper, and then saying, how far am I going to deviate from that opinion? So it's so important to get this right. You want to introduce your theory. You want to position your study in the existing literature. And the most important thing, I've mentioned Dave Ketchen's name twice now. I'm going to mention him a third time. Some advice that he gave me early on is that every paper needs a big hook. Right? What's the one thing that your paper is going to be known for? So often, and I've been so guilty of this, we get to the end of our introduction and we say, and our paper makes 3 contributions to the literature, right? And you really don't, right? And so it's so important to just get that one thing so that when people think of your paper, this is what it's about. And if you do that well, the rest is easy, right? If you can get that, even if it's just one IV and one DV, right? One main relationship. If you do that well and it's rock solid, the rest is so much easier. So have that big hook. The first paragraph is everything. And one other thing about the introduction is the importance of establishing your DV, right? Sometimes people will just kind of assume that their DV is important, but even if it's firm performance or fraud, or you've got to establish why it is that important that you're looking at this thing. So after the introduction, you want to set the stage. So here you're saying, what is your paper about? The IV, the DV, the theory, the literature stream, the research setting. All of this needs to be consistent. You want to have some consistent framing here. So whatever you're saying in that first sentence, that's going to be the first thing that you talk about when you're setting the stage. If you were to look at my papers, you will see whatever I say in the first sentence, when I finish my introduction, the next thing that I talk about is whatever I said in that first sentence. So it's consistent. You know exactly what this paper is about. And it could be, you're making decisions what your paper is going to be about. It could be about the IV. It could be about the DV. It could be just about the theory, right? So there's a variety, or it could be about something at a little higher level of abstraction, like corporate governance, for example, right? And so you're trying to situate your paper within a literature stream right from the beginning, and then be consistent with that throughout as you set the stage. It's important here to define things that might be seemingly obvious. I just rejected a paper 2 days ago from an Ivy League author that one of the reviewers hit the nail on the head. One of the reviewers said, there might be something interesting here, but it's so confusing that I don't know what it is. So it's really important that, although you might feel that the constructs that you're talking about have been in the literature enough that you don't need to define them, is be able to approach that early on, where you're defining these things so that you know that the readers will know exactly what you're talking about. You've probably heard this before, situate it within a conversation, right? Or the party analogy, you walk into a room and you want to make sure you're walking up to a set of people that are talking about something and talk within their language. And rather than saying, and now for something completely different, right? Situate it within a conversation, and then leave this section with something pithy, something unanswered, a question that unanswered that everybody wants the answer to, right? So when you get to the end of your conceptual development section, you want to leave with people saying, oh, so yeah, this is what we want to answer with this paper. Then we move to the hypotheses section, and we want one clear, testable, conceptual prediction for H1, right? So by one, I mean don't have two things in your hypothesis, right? Clear. So this is something that I've really worked with my doctoral students on a lot this semester, and it's worked out quite well, is to really just know from your hypotheses very simply, here's your IV and here's your DV. Keep the relationships very simple and understandable. And testable. Sometimes I'll write in reviews, well, what would happen if this hypothesis were not true, right? Could that be the case? Probably not, right? In fact, if this hypothesis were not true, I'd say something's wrong with your data, right? And so you have to make sure that your hypothesis is testable and that it's something that can be refuted. And two other things here. One is I think that hypotheses should, in general, be at the construct level. Too often we will introduce our research context early on, and then we'll be putting operationalizations into our hypotheses. It's so much more powerful if we can keep that at a little bit higher level of abstraction. And also, because it's a hypothesis, we'd want to pay close attention to your levels of analysis. So again, that paper that I just rejected had two different levels in one hypothesis, right? They were, which, okay, if you're hypothesizing a multi-level model, then maybe that's okay, but you need to pay close attention to the levels of analysis and to time. And so how does time fit into your hypotheses? Then we move on to the methods section. So it's important that you be able to replicate, and so you certainly want to be transparent here, have as much information as possible about your measures and what you're putting forward. Anything that's missing is kind of a yellow flag, right? The reviewers can see past scant data or just not mentioning things. They're going to call you out on that. So it's really important, especially I think the higher the level of journal that you're submitting to, the more important it is to just be completely transparent about what you've done. So if somebody picks up your article, they can do it again, right? They can replicate what you've done. I think it's important too, to, when you have tables and graphs, to have them be purposeful. Make sure that they're doing something for you. You don't want a figure that says, this is a horse, and there's a horse, right? You want to have figures that it would be difficult to understand what's going on if you were to just read about it. And tables as well. Anytime somebody's got like some descriptive table, I almost always tell them to take it out. We just don't need, here's all our measures, right? Things like that. That's not adding value. And so you really want to be purposeful in terms of adding value to the paper with your tables and figures. I think it's important here to make sure, this is a minor point, but making sure the order of what's happening in the text is what's unfolding in the tables. So that it just makes it easier to move back and forth. Less minor though, this is important, really important, is explaining the shapes of your figures. So I just explained this to one of my doctoral students, and let's see if I can get it right. If you think about a line, right, you need 2 points to define a line. Okay, you get 2 points on a graph and you can define a line. And then oftentimes we're looking at moderators, right? And we've got a line and we've got another line, right? And so that second line has 2 points, right? So when you're describing a moderator, I want to see at least 4 paragraphs. The 2 points for the first line and the 2 points that define the second line. Because too often we'll put a moderator in there and then we won't describe everything that's happening in the moderator, and that's not defensible. We'll just describe one of the lines, or we'll just describe the left side of the graph. And so it's rare that I see a moderator that describes all 4 quadrants, if you will, right? All 4 scenarios of the moderating lines. It's important to cover all aspects of this shape. And then the last part is the findings and the theory. Explaining the discussion, right? And so you certainly want to have any unexpected findings in here and findings that came before. But one thing that I always say to my co-authors is that we get one paragraph to summarize, right? And then after that, I don't want to say in the discussion anything that we've said in the paper. Because that's, I think, the biggest fault with discussions, is they just repeat everything we've already said, right? And so it needs to be new. It needs to be a part of the paper that's adding value beyond what you've already said. Here it'd be important to consider impact. We've talked a little about that already. And limitations. I always put a limitation section in as a short limitation section on initial review. And the reason is I don't want to put this long laundry list of limitations that ends up being a bullseye for reviewers, but I do want to have a position in the paper where later during the review process, when they give me some comments that I just can't address, right? There's some data I can't collect or things that we don't have the answer to, then at a minimum I can put it in this section, right, and help me get through the review process a little bit. And then what's the last thing that you want the reviewer to read before they start writing their review? Hopefully it's not the limitations section, right? So I always have a conclusion, right? Because, and the conclusion is very general. It's something that I haven't said before. It's taking what we found and bringing it to a very, very high level, and usually using the vernacular. Very short, 1-paragraph conclusion that just reminds the reviewers, oh, you know what, this is a really important paper, and here's why it's important. And lastly is just a few important, with respect to crafting the paper, is a few important tips to remember. For the love of all that is good, don't do these things, or do these things. Some things that just drive editors and reviewers crazy. Is make sure you proofread the beginning of your paper. I'll get papers that have errors in the title. So be sure you spend some time there. Get friendly reviews. None of us are too good for that. You know, I'm always getting friendly reviews. And even if you've got the consultant co-authors on your paper, even if you've got some big names on your paper, even if you've got 4 authors, still I'm sending my paper out for a friendly review before I submit it. Because you're gonna hear things. People that are giving friendly reviews aren't in the forest with you, right? They're going to see things in a completely different way. They're really worthwhile. Make sure you pay attention to the formatting of the journal where you're trying to submit to, because it's kind of a dialect, right? You know, a lot of times I'll get so I'm associate editor at the Academy of Management Journal, and a lot of times I'll get finance or accounting papers, and they just haven't put their paper into our language, right? And formatting is part of that. You know, the theory's too short, or you know, by formatting I mean the construction of the paper, not necessarily the font size, right? But you know, how they've assembled the paper. They just don't assemble it in ways that we're familiar with. And so when I give that to reviewers, I know that it's just so much of it is foreign to them. So think about the papers that are in the journal and trying to follow their format as much as you can, just because it's going to help you. You know, it's going to help you overcome the hurdle of understanding. I think citations you should have a citation strategy. And a lot of times this is the last thing I'll do, is that, you know, I'll oversight the whole paper and usually have twice as many citations as we need. And the last thing I'll do is think about the citation strategy for the whole paper and get rid of half of the cites. And so that I'm really strategic in when I'm bringing up citations, in which literature I'm citing the most. Because you know, the editors, one of the first things they're going to do is decide who your reviewers are. And let me tell you, that's a huge decision-making point for your paper, right? Yeah, it's important what the reviewers say, but who those reviewers are, that's going to be a key determinant of your success. And so you can have an impact on who those reviewers are by citing the work that you want the reviewer pool to reflect. And lastly is sometimes having a proofreader can be helpful. I've used a proofreader several times. There's no shame in that. And so it can be helpful. You know, the reverse is I've submitted papers where reviewers have said, you've just got too many errors in here, you know, grammatical things, and it caused me to stumble, right? It makes it difficult for them to understand. So it does not hurt to send your paper to a proofreader. Another important point here is to make sure that you reference the journal that you're submitting to, because you want to make sure that you are working within an existing conversation in your journal. So that's what I have on crafting a paper. I have a few other slides here on the reviewing process and that sort of thing. Are there any questions or any points of discussion with respect to writing papers and what we've just talked about there?
I've just got a query regarding your comment about measures.
Yeah.
So you mentioned not to include them in a table, which is
right.
what I always do. I'm marketing, by the way.
Okay.
So do you put the items in the body of, in the body of the text? Is that what you would do?
Yeah. And so my general point that I'm trying to make there is to make sure that your tables are adding value over and above what you can say. And marketing journals might be different, but you know what? The body of the text is going to include a description of each of your variables. And so having a table that repeats all that information, that says, you know, the name of the variable and then how you measured it, is not adding a whole lot. So generally, I'll tell people, maybe not in the initial review, but if the paper is going to be accepted, that's one of the things we'll say, is that's not adding value, so let's get rid of that.
Just following up on that, and this is probably the next part you're going to talk about, but I wrote it now. In the review stage, sometimes I try to avoid using tables at all for the reasons you only when they absolutely have to go in. But sometimes reviewers ask you to put tables in.
Yeah.
And then I always find that a problem because the table is disconnected. It's a very artificial add-on, and then I find myself adding more paragraphs, and before you know it, flow is destroyed, the paper's extended.
Yeah.
Have you found any useful ways of responding to that?
Yeah, I have actually. Is that I think that we have some new tools available to us in terms of online supplements, right? And so I'll use that as a tool to manage reviewers sometimes. And it used to be before that we would just maybe include the table in the responses to reviewers and say, we're putting it here so that you can see it. It's not in our paper yet, but would be welcome to put it there if you like. Now what I'll do is I'll say, here's a battery of tables or a supplementary analysis that we can make available offline or online, but it's not going to be in the paper. And a similar strategy that I've adopted sometimes as well is that if the journal doesn't necessarily want to do an online supplement, would be to say, we've created this supplement that if anyone has inquiries, which people do from time to time, they'll ask about your paper or ask about your data, this is what we can send them. And so that the reviewers know, they say, oh, if somebody inquires about the paper, they've got this specific thing that they're going to get, sort of a kind of a built-in appendix, if you will. And so I've done that, and that's really helpful. For example, if you've got a new method and you don't want to devote 6 pages to describing the method, and so you can just have this kind of standalone paper that just talks about, look, this method's not in the management or the marketing literature yet, but here's what we know about it and how to implement it.
Just talking about these online supplements and whatnot, do you subscribe to the theory that you should provide your data, make it available to people online? And how does that fit with what you were saying before about having, perhaps multiple DVs for one IV or whatever, and therefore publishing more than one paper out?
Yeah. So a couple of questions there. One is the availability of data, and I always make my data available. And I think in general, journals would want authors to do that, and there's varying levels of requirements with respect to that, depending on the journal. But I think there's an expectation that if people will ask for your data, that you'll give it to them. I think that there's also, if somebody asks for my data from a paper that's just published, then certainly, I'm going to provide them. Maybe not all the derivations of the of how I got to that, but the ultimate data, the coded data that they can use to check my results and whatnot. If somebody asks for my data from a paper from 10 or 15 years ago, sometimes it gets a little bit more difficult. But you certainly want to try. What I try to do is after I finish a paper, is I get my data in a format where if somebody asks, this is how I'd share it, right? So that I can go back quite a few years. And the related question there is, using an IV and a DV. So oftentimes we'll get a cover letter with a submission that says, here, I use this data in this particular article. Or sometimes they'll say an article under review, and they'll provide the article under review at some other journal where I'm also using this data. And then they'll justify why they could be able to use it again. I've got a completely different DV and some different theory that, so that's useful because we read that and then we'll generally make a decision about, the overlap. Every time I get those letters, I take them quite seriously, and I look at the papers where they've already published using the data and make sure that, because you don't want to go through this review process only to find out later, oh, this other paper is so close, and now, that would reflect terribly on the journal. Other thoughts about that? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. Apology for being late.
No worries.
One of the issues with more what I call functionalist papers is that often the methodology and the model, etc., can be very similar to what's been done before. And so you get a high, similarity index.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you treat that problem?
I wish I had a great answer to that because I actually submitted a paper to a top journal, and it was not desk rejected, but like a minor desk edit, they call it, saying this paper is really has a very high similarity index, indicating plagiarism, right? The problem is you've plagiarized your own paper, right? And what happened is we had a very complex methodology that we had in one other paper, and we mimicked that. We had that same methodology, and we explained it. The sentences were too similar, right? And so, our approach was simply to try to explain it in the same way, but using different words. That's really the only solution I have. Because it turns out you can plagiarize yourself, and if you do that in a theoretical section, that's something you have to certainly overcome. But the question you have is, how many different ways can you describe the same theory, right? And I don't really have a good answer to that, because I feel like we did a pretty good job the first time around, and so maybe it's just more of referencing the first time, and so that you don't have to explain it all over again. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Other thoughts or questions?
Just interested as well about your comment in respect to having your DV in the introduction.
Yes.
So would it depend on what the sort of hero of your paper is? So if, for instance, your DV is relatively boring and it's the moderation or the mediation, then perhaps you don't need to... should you be talking about all your variables, all your constructs in the introduction, or not necessarily?
I think so. I would. Now you can frame your paper around the moderator. Maybe the moderator is the most interesting aspect of the paper, and so you can frame your paper in the opening paragraph about these two different ways that the relationship is working. But I think ultimately that you've got to come back in the introduction and say why your DV is important. Because if you don't, now you've got a moderator that's explaining something that nobody really cares about, right? And so you need to convince the reviewers that ultimately what you're looking at is important. Yeah. Anything else? Well, let's talk for a minute about the review process then. So I want to explain why I rejected your paper. And I've got a mnemonic device here, is the 3 T's of why I reject most papers. The first is theoretical contribution. This is, AMJ is looking for a theoretical contribution, and this is by far the most common reason and the most commonly used first point in my decision letters. It's so common that I've got this little paragraph right here that I can cut and paste because I'm saying the same things over and over again. Is that people are investigating an interesting phenomena, or they're using theory maybe in a new context, but they're not adding to the theory. And that's so important. Is at AMJ, that's what we're looking for, is that you need to add to the theory in some way. The second T is the front end does not match the back end, and the begins with T. So we can. So here you've got a problem where you've got some you've got this wonderful theory, and everything kind of makes sense, and then you don't measure any of it, right? Or it could be the opposite, where you've got this incredible data, but you've kind of force-fitted some theory. So a frequent comment that I'll have here is, imagine that I took your operationalization and I gave it to 100 scholars and said, what are they measuring? I think I'd get 100 different answers, right? And so you got to make sure that what you're measuring is actually what you've theorized about. And then the last T is having bad data. Here the T is in the middle, but it's an easy way to remember it anyway. So if you've got some data that it's either old or misguided, or the sample size is too small, or for some way your data is not believable, oftentimes I'll have reviewers saying, I got to the end of the method section and I just am not convinced that they are seeing what they think they're seeing. Right? So these, I think, are some of the reasons why I would reject a paper. But then the revision is different. Why would I reject a revision? I'm terrible at mnemonic devices. So I have a mnemonic device of DNW, which is hard to remember. So the first is, you didn't do what the reviewers asked. We all took comprehensive exams, right? And the most important point you tell doctoral students in the comprehensive exam is to answer the question that was asked. So often they'll just go on and on eloquently about some theory or something, but it's not what we asked about. The same is true with reviewers. Reviewers are asking for something specific. Be sure to do those specific things and everything that they ask. A great example here, I submitted an article to the Journal of Management. I was still a doctoral student. We had 3 reviewers. 2 of them liked the paper, and 1 of them just hated it. They just slammed us. And so my strategy was to do everything that the first 2 reviewers asked for, and to kind of convince the 3rd reviewer that, it's fine. What you're asking for, we don't really need to do. Well, as you might imagine, that paper was rejected. It's now in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. You can't just get around a reviewer. I mean, ultimately, in the review process, that 3rd reviewer came back and said, I still don't like your paper for all the same reasons, right? And the editor was stuck with, well, you know what? They're right about a lot of these things. So you can't just leave reviewers in a lurch. You need to be looking what they're asking for and doing what they're asking for. And I think, actually, everything that they ask for. Here's something, see if I can say this without messing it up. So what am I trying to say here? Is that if I were to give you 2 papers, I have 2 options. All right, here's a paper where I've got some reviewer comments, and I have done what I feel that should be done. And the reviewers had a few comments that I disagreed with, and I just said, you know what? I'm not doing those things because I don't agree with them, all right? And the second paper is, I've done everything that the reviewers ask. Some would argue that we ought to just do what we believe is best. I am not of that camp. I feel like the academic community will be better off when we do everything the reviewers ask, because the collective body is smarter than the individual, right? And I feel like more often than not that second paper is going to end up better than the first. And so even when unless it's something where I feel like the reviewers are just wrong, right, or misunderstanding what we're doing, I am going to do what the reviewers ask. And I feel like my papers and my collectively, the scientific community is better off when we do it that way. Another problem here is not making bold enough changes, is just trying to satisfy, if you will. Here, a good example is I had a paper at SMJ, and I knew how to respond to reviewers. I knew we needed to collect more data, but we just weren't willing to do it. It was just lazy. And so the paper was rejected. We weren't bold enough. So what did we do? We got that rejection. We collected more data. We submitted it to the Journal of Management, and it was accepted at the Journal of Management. If we had just done that and been bold enough to take those steps, even if it takes a while, there's no trouble with saying, look, we need more time. We'll give all the time in the world, right, as long as we can get it right. So it's worth it to make bold changes. At the same time, you don't want to write a whole new paper. So I got rejected here as well, where we had, this was at the Academy of Management Journal, and we took our dependent variable and we made it a moderator. And okay, well, and then we kind of vaguely explained, well, it's the same sort of paper. We just kind of moved that here, and it was just a completely different paper. And the reviewers saw right through that and said, yeah, you're just doing something different, right? And it's almost like we've started the review process over again. And in the process, they said, I wouldn't give you an R&R on that paper anyway. So that paper was rejected. I think...
Just ask, Chris, I think that's quite a fine balance. I've found with a couple of European journals in particular, the reviewers will give you a checklist dozen or more points.
Yeah.
And by the time you've done that for, say, 2 reviewers,
Yeah.
and you're systematic about it,
Yeah.
you then send it back, and they say, this is a different paper, but in actual fact,
Yeah.
you're simply responding to their comments, to add this moderator, make that adjustment. And so that's an extremely challenging balance I've found. When I get these long lists, I often think, oh, this is going to be very hard
I agree.
to not alter the paper to the point where they then reject it because they
Yeah.
think you've
Too much.
started again. But if you don't, then you're actually not, as you suggested, responding to
You responded, yeah. And I think the problem there lies not in your response, but in the reviewers. And so at AMJ, we've moved, this was under Jason Colquitt, I think, we've moved to a review process where we've said, we want 4 to 6 main points. And my reviews are either 3 or 4 main points. And because later, you know, in the third R&R, we can iron out a few details, right? And that can come later. But we want to get the main points, especially in that first R&R. And so I think if you're dealing with 3 or 4, maybe 5 main points, and more often than not, you know, 3 of those 5 are going to have overlap between all the reviewers. And that, I think, helps address that problem. And then it becomes the editor's job, too. In my decision letters, I've always got 3 things that I want them to address. And then, because I know if they can do that, then I'm going to have another opportunity where we can get, you know, in a little bit more detail.
So just to follow up on that, one of the things that I'm hearing from editors in some of the journals and conferences and stuff like that, they're saying they're really aiming for no more than sort of 2 R&Rs or two
Yeah,
revisions.
this is
so
true.
What happens then when you're probably not going to be able to get to those polishing stages that you might have in a third?
Yeah, and you know, I've only been an associate editor for, I guess, a year now, and so you know, my policy, or I should say, my practice has been that it's probably going to take a third R&R, but frankly, what I've seen is those that are more experienced than me are making that decision after the second R&R. And so, you know, maybe they're just better at it than me, or maybe I think what I'm realizing is that, you know, some of the smaller things that I'm dealing with at the third R&R, maybe I'm trying too much to write the paper that I want instead of letting the authors write the paper, you know, that they want. And so I think you're right, though. I think there's certainly a trend at some of the better journals to make that decision at the second R&R. Largely, and you know, most of my third R&Rs, you know, they're 90% that it's going to make it through. Largely, those second R&Rs are that's kind of the upper out, you know, decision.
The advice you're giving is fabulous for the top 4 journals in any discipline. When you get down to the next 6 to 20 journals,
Yeah.
you often have to deal with inexperienced area editors or
Yes,
editors themselves that really don't want to make a call, they don't want to offend a reviewer or whatever.
Oh yeah.
And you end up getting this laundry list of things to do, some of which are contradictory. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So it's really the editor's job. And you know, I think sometimes there's one thing that people don't take advantage of enough, and that is hiding behind the editor, right? And so you can, I mean, if you've got something that's contradictory, I would suggest emailing the editor about it. In general, when somebody emails me about something and says, you know, what should we do about this or that, I'm not going to respond. In general, because I feel like, you know, here I am, you know, my one daughter, you know, is got problems with friends at the high school, and then the other daughter is at Stanford. I got to pay her tuition, and then, you know, and then I come in and my doctoral students aren't doing what they're supposed to do, and I've got all these other students complaining about their grade, and then I've got 18 research projects, right? And then I get this email that says, we were wondering if we should measure performance using ROA or ROE. You know, I got a lot of things on my mind, you know, and for me to be able to answer that question, I would have to really get enmeshed in your paper, and I just can't. So for most of those questions, I won't respond. The questions I do respond to are, we're getting conflicting advice from reviewers, because I feel like that's my job as an editor, is I've got to manage reviewers. So that's one strategy. And other than that, I think you've got to choose, a reviewer and go with one. But then in the response to the second, I would generally say, great idea, but this other reviewer asked us to do it this way, and we selected that just because it was a better fit for this or that reason, yeah. So trying to make sure that two reviewers are talking to each other that way. Yeah. Others? Just a couple other minor comments here is that I create standalone responses for each reviewer, because I don't think that reviewers always read the whole response document. I think they turn to their questions that they asked, and so yeah, I'm not. I repeat things from one reviewer to another, and I respond to every comment within a comment. So if a reviewer gives this paragraph, I'm going to make sure that every point in there I respond to in particular. And lastly here is if you are a reviewer. So a few things to remember here if you're reviewing. For AMJ, I know these are some of the things that we're looking for is timeliness. I think it's important to submit your review a week before it's due. Because we're looking to get a fast turnaround time on these things, and we're only as fast as the slowest reviewer. And so your reviews, there's a couple of things that stick with you from the time of your first review when you've just graduated all the way through your entire career at a particular journal, is your review time and your grade for a review. Every review you write for AMJ, you get a grade from the editor. And those stick with you for your career. So you want to make sure that you submit your review on time and that it's thorough, because the grade is just 1 to 5, right, on a scale, and the grade is reflective of did you look at the entire paper. If you just review the front end and then say, yeah, and it was so bad that I'm not even going to review the methods. That's not helpful. That's going to hurt your grade. So you want to be able to look at the entire paper and provide some thoughts on the whole thing, even if you feel like the front end didn't make much sense to you, and just being thoughtful too. Writing the review that you would want. So a few things to do here. Write the review you'd like to receive. Open with some positive comments, because the first thing that we're going to do in our decision letter is say, here's what we liked about the paper. We want to be able to pull some things from the reviewers. This, I think, is really important, and I only see this in probably about 10% of the reviews that I get, is offer a solution to problems. Too often we'll just say, here's what's wrong with your paper, and we're trained for that, right? From the time we're doctoral students, when people start getting up and talking about their research, the first thing we're thinking is, all right, well, what's wrong with what they're saying, right? And so you want to be able to say, well, here's what's wrong, but you might think about this or you might think about that. Those are the best reviews. It's so helpful to be able to say, and even if you're rejecting the paper, to be able to say, here's something you might think about in the future. Because that's part of our charter as a journal, is not just the papers that we're accepting and publishing, but helping people to develop their papers and their work. Number your points so that the editors can refer to them easily. And I think prioritize them by importance rather than chronology of the paper, so that we know what you're most concerned about. Don't do these things. Don't copy edit, because these papers go through rigorous copy editing after the revision process. So you don't have to worry about little things. Don't suggest a decision, reject or revise. Let the editor do that, and you're just trying to give some cannon fodder for the editor. But you don't want to kind of put the editor in a bind where okay, well now I feel like I have to go in this or that direction, or I'm going in the other direction, but I have to explain why it's different from what this person has recommended. Don't be positive in your review, but then recommend rejection. That really puts the editor in a bind, because now you're rejecting, but it looks like the reviewers like the paper, right? So you don't want to be negative in your comments to the editor, but positive in your comments to the authors. And we talked a little about this, demanding the authors write the paper you would write. And as you mentioned, I think this gets different as your papers move down. If you get rejected from some of the top journals and you start moving down a little bit, maybe you're starting to get more of that. And so that's something you have to be careful of as a reviewer. And I know some reviewers that are condescending, and it just hurts, and so there's no need for that as well. I have 2 more slides before we do any questions or thoughts or comments about being a reviewer or getting your paper rejected or revision process and that sort of thing.
What do you think is obviously it's going to change how long is a piece of string, but in terms of how long do you think the effective reviews usually are? I'm finding I probably tend to write way too long because
I think 2 pages single spaced, 1.5 pages single spaced would be enough. Even a page single spaced would be fine. I think when it gets longer than that, if you get multiple reviews that are longer than that, there's just so much for the authors to do, and they don't necessarily need to jump through all those hurdles in order to know if the paper is publishable or not. Yeah.
I think the other thing as a reviewer is if you see a hole, say in the methodology or perhaps in the literature review, it's really helpful to provide a good exemplar paper to frame your argument. You are omitted to consider this area. This is a leading, this is a paper you should have considered. And
that's a brilliant point. Yeah, it's really good. And I liked your word as an exemplar. That's been really useful for me. For example, we had a paper that was just accepted at AMJ, and in the review process, the reviewers talked about our moderators, and a common concern of moderators, they say, look, why these moderators? You've probably gotten those reviews. Why this collection of moderators? And you don't really have a good answer for it, right? And this reviewer said, you want to choose some moderators that are going to establish that the underlying mechanism of your theory, because the theory of your main relationship, you're not really measuring it. You can't. There's kind of this black box in the middle, and you've kind of got these governance IV and then the performance DV, and you don't really know what's happening in the middle. So grab some moderators that are going to say, if that relationship is true, and if the theory that I use to describe that relationship is true, then when this moderator is high, the whole thing's going to go away, right? And do that several times, and now you haven't measured what you said you're going to measure, but at least you've defended your theory. And they said, and here's a great example of folks that have done that. And I think it was Wang and Qian in an AMJ in 2013. That was the example of it. And so we turned to that paper and we said, oh my gosh, not only is it an example, but it's a very relevant example to similar data that we're using. And so it was perfect for us. And it was so such an education for me. I just felt like, boy, now that reviewer really made a difference in my life, because now that's what I'm doing in a lot of my papers, right? And so it was great to have that exemplar. It's a good point. Yeah. Others?
Do you have any strategy of how to better spell out the theoretical contribution?
Yeah. How to spell out the theoretical contribution, yeah. No, I don't. God almighty, is hard, isn't it? The one question I've just really struggled with is what's a theoretical contribution, and how to get it. It's so hard. I think for the most part, a lot of us know what it isn't, right? And so we can define, this is just phenomenological, or this is just applying theory, right? But it's a lot harder to think about how can we have a contribution. And so, I think there's a few things here. One is if we can extend it a little bit. If we can take theory and find a boundary condition where the whole thing goes away or the whole thing is flipped on its head. That is, I think, one of the easier ways to have a theoretical contribution is if we can find some sort of boundary condition that changes the nature of the theory. Or if we can take theory and pick at an assumption of the theory. So, for example, the behavioral agency model, right? Took agency theory and looked at the economic assumptions of the agent and said, but if we take that away, everything about agency theory changes, right? And then they looked at executive compensation and how that changes what we know of executive compensation. So, picking at an assumption of a theory can really be a useful way to have a contribution as well. Does anyone else have any thoughts about how to uncover a theoretical contribution? Yeah, about the same as me, right? Yeah, it's really challenging, isn't it? I think it's probably the biggest challenge. And at AMJ, unless you can do that, the paper's just not going to get in, right? And so it's important to do that. We talked a little bit about framing. At AMJ, more than other journals, it's likely that you're going to want to push that theoretical contribution to the forefront of your paper. And when I get a paper rejected from AMJ and I move to another journal, a lot of times I'll feel like, our theoretical contribution just wasn't what we thought it was. And so I'll change the framing, and I'll make the framing more phenomenological, and then come back with a contribution to theory later and say, we extend theory or add to the literature in this way, but make a little bit less about, we're changing everything we know about this particular theory. Another way to have a theoretical contribution would be to take a theory from a different discipline that just has never been used in management. That can be great. Like threat rigidity theory, right? Or with the fight, flee, or freeze response, right? And that was in anthropology, right? And you start applying that to organizations, and that there's a lot of opportunity there. And then there's opportunity too to take that threat rigidity theory and then adapt it a little bit, so that you can have more theoretical contributions as you adapt it to other contexts within organizations, looking at, for example, different kinds of threats.
If it's a very narrow focused area, sometimes you can manage to squeeze in a systematic review of the literature and position where the literature is at and find what you made the boundary and say, what happens outside here, and propose that somehow it's different.
Right.
But it's got to be a terribly niche area where you can in a space of a few pages, you can systematically review the literature and indicate that.
That's a great point. Yeah, especially if you've got something that's reasonably well established, right? So you can review it in a way that folks haven't done before. I think that's really helpful too with reviews. If you can find a way to review a theory in a way that people haven't thought of it before, like defining it in a different framework, or putting it, if you look at it through these three lenses or something like that, that can be a useful way to review.
I was interested in the point you made earlier, because we do see it all too often, that people say, here are my 3 theoretical contributions, and they kind of list them.
Yep,
and
I do it all the
talking
time.
about the main, so do I. We're talking before about, the sort of main hook. So you think in the introduction that it's best just to focus in on what your main theoretical contribution is?
It's a classic case of do what I say, not what I do, because if you start reading my papers, every last paragraph of the introduction says we have 3 contributions, and I guess that comes back to the issue that we talked about of the format and structure of the paper. Yeah, that's what people are expecting, and so I don't want. I'm afraid really to say we have 1 contribution, because I'm afraid the reviewers are going to say, well, that's not enough, right? And so I'm a chicken. But frankly, what I believe is that, if you can have 1 contribution and it's really defensible, that's everything. That if you just got 1 thing that your paper is really good at, I would much rather have that than 3 things that year, everyone just kind of scratches it. I suppose that's a contribution, you know.
And it makes it difficult at the end to come back if you've got a diversity of contributions.
Yeah,
To come back and sell what you've actually delivered.
Right, yes.
This was good, that was all right, that wasn't too bad. It's much weaker than saying, so we've comprehensively demonstrated this one relationship.
I agree, yeah.
May I, since I brought up the conclusion, may I ask you a question? You suggested a very brief conclusion.
Yeah.
I always think that's a nice idea, but I never managed to get there. I think your idea of drawing the limitations earlier into the paper is a good way. But I always feel that you're under an obligation to revisit your research question in your conclusion.
Yeah, oh no, great point, yeah.
It's hard to do that comprehensively and remind the reviewer or the reader of your contribution to theory, all in one paragraph.
Yeah.
Do you have any reflections on that?
I don't deal with contribution to theories much in the conclusion. What I try and do, and half my conclusions get eliminated in the review process. Half the time people just say, you don't need that. Okay. And it comes back to the notion of doing what the reviewers ask. If one reviewer says they don't want that, I take it out. But I don't try to come back to the theoretical contribution. What I try to do is I think more about implications in the conclusion and the vernacular. You know, in just trying to explain, well, this is really important for this reason. You know, managers are going to be really interested in this. You know, so it's just saying things in a way that I haven't said in the paper, and it's adding value in the sense that, and this is just a personal preference for me, it's just the way I do it, but it's adding value in the sense that it's leaving the reviewers with this notion that, oh, you know what, this is going to be really important. Like the Wall Street Journal is going to be interested in this, right? That's what I'm trying to get at in my conclusions. Is that we took the business plan. We have a business plan competition, and you've probably seen the business plan canvas. I don't know how universal that is, but we took that business plan canvas, which is designed to evaluate new business ideas, and we said, let's apply this to the research process. And so this thing can be really handy, and I'll email this to Ingrid in case you guys want to use it. But we use this with our doctoral students, and I use it in my own research. Every time I'm coming up with a research idea, this is the first thing I do, is I just start filling this out, and I actually have a giant one. Right, and with a kind of a whiteboard thing that I fill out with my co-authors. So what's our research question? And then here's the questions we ask about the gap in knowledge. What's known about your topic? What do we need to know about the topic? Why is it important to learn this? So there's the importance of the DV, right? And then we have to jump to the theory. You know, you want to be able to say, what theory are you using in your paper? And you don't want, 4, right? So you need to be able to answer that from the beginning. And then what are the core tenets of that theory? And this comes back to the question of contribution. Are you applying it in a new context, uncovering a boundary condition, contrasting competing theories, or introducing something new to the theory, right? So that gets to the issue of contribution. Your hypotheses, what are the specific hypotheses that you're testing? What's novel about them? What's the unifying theme behind your hypotheses? And then talk about your sample. What organizations are we going to go to? Who are the key actors, and why this sample and not some other sample? And then look at the specific operationalizations. And then these are a little bit more general on the value chain here. Is what are the boundary conditions to your theory? What assumptions are you making about values, time, and space? Where does your theorizing apply, and where does it not apply? What are the top alternative explanations? This is a common reviewer comment, is that you got all the way to the end here, but we could have explained this using some other theory, right? And they will name the theory. And your analysis, what techniques are you going to use? Why are these the best choices? What supplementary analyses? That more and more, as you mentioned, trends in the journals, more and more we're seeing supplementary analyses to account for either endogeneity or some other reason, robustness. What are your limitations? And then who are the key partners? Who's going to guide you through the research process? What does this person bring to this project? This comes to this issue of co-authors that we touched on briefly, right? And what responsibilities are you going to expect of each of the different co-authors in terms of drafting, editing, revising, data collection, analysis, grunt work? So we iron these things out and we get it on paper right at the beginning of a project. This has been a really useful tool, so I wanted to mention it briefly. Any other last questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions from a slightly different angle.
Okay.
I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner.
All right.
After external engagement. My first question is, in my own field of work in industry, I do occasionally read academic papers.
Yeah.
And of particular interest to me is always the abstract, the introduction and
Sure.
conclusion, and how well it's written. Is there any correlation between how well it's written for a practitioner and whether it's well written or not? Is one question.
Yeah.
The second question is from, there is this real or perceived tension about whether you can get a scholarly paper funded by industry,
Yeah.
and whether these are two different things.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, the answer to your first question is yes, I think. And in fact, SMJ now is having people write managerial summaries, right, which are fantastic. I love writing them. For me, this is something that I love to do. I love to describe my research in ways that my family can understand, right? And I feel like, I mean, there's a lot of things I'm not good at. I'm really good at that. I love doing that. And a lot of times I will take my research and after it's published, I'll create a 2 or 3 minute video just to describe that main point. And so as a result, and then I'll share that with the media and that sort of thing. As a result, sometimes I'll be quoted in the Wall Street Journal or USA Today or something for this particular research. So I think that's a really important step, is to be able to translate that. And your question was, is that correlated with how good the article is? I don't know about that. I feel like there's a related question, though. Sometimes people will say, well, either you're good at research or you're good at teaching, and why is that people are this tension between the two? I feel like the best researchers are often the best teachers, and I'm constantly bringing my research into the classroom. I'm going to give you an example. So this doctoral student, he comes to me and he's got this article that talks about facial symmetry, right? And it's about the NFL. And it turns out that we use facial symmetry to determine how good-looking people are. And anthropologists have found this is true. And it works, because when you have higher facial symmetry, you actually have better genes, you better DNA, there's fewer problems. And what this article found was that NFL quarterbacks have off-the-charts facial symmetry, because they can throw the ball a little farther, run a little faster. And not only that, but within quarterbacks, as facial symmetry increases, their performance increases. It's nuts, right? So this actually works. So he came to me with this thing, and he said, we should measure the facial symmetry of CEOs. So we did. And we grabbed all these pictures of CEOs, and we looked just at CEOs that had committed fraud. And we measured all their facial symmetry, and we said, now, are they more or less likely, the really good-looking ones, are they more or less likely to lose their job in the wake of fraud, right? And so now you've got this fraud, and you got the really good-looking CEOs. Are they going to be held to a higher standard or let off the hook? So we could go around the room, and I guess would probably, when I've shared that story, people have differing opinions about that. And so that, I think, is a really interesting just way of translating your research for practitioners. Now, his study goes into a ton of detail about moderators and the way he measured it and all that, and it's really boring. I mean, if I were to give you his paper, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. But you can take the main point of an article and make it really interesting for practitioners. What was the second part of your question?
Question about the ability to get industry to...
Oh, yeah. I'm a terrible person to answer that question, because I have not done that myself. And I think that occurs a lot more both in Australia and on the OB side, because our micro researchers at Auburn, they are getting inside organizations a lot more than our strategy researchers, because I think because our strategy researchers can download data very easily. At the same time, what I've done is, as I mentioned, I do research on corporate governance. So I've become a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors, and I am constantly going to their meetings, and my research is informed by their practice, right? And so I've not personally done what you're talking about. I've known people that have been very successful at doing that, and and most of them have been on the micro side, looking at behavior within organizations. So it's just a brief answer anyway. So they're held to a higher standard, by the way. CEOs are, yeah. In fact, the CEO, if you're one standard deviation above the norm on facial symmetry, you're 18 times more likely to lose your job in the wake of fraud than if you're one standard deviation below on standard.